On a quiet evening, a young police officer was driving through a peaceful suburban neighborhood. He had recently joined the force and was still getting used to the responsibilities that came with the job. As he cruised along, his eyes caught a car swerving slightly from side to side. It wasn't a major issue, but enough to raise suspicion. Without hesitation, the officer turned on his sirens and signaled for the car to pull over. He had done this countless times before, but this stop would turn out to be anything but routine. The car slowly rolled to the side of the road, and the officer followed suit, coming to a stop behind it. He approached the driver's side window, his hand resting on his holster, as he was taught to do in training. Inside, a middle-aged black woman sat behind the wheel, looking calm and collected. She rolled down her window as the officer politely asked for her license and registration. Her eyes were steady, but there was no hint of panic or nervousness, which the officer found a bit strange. Most people he pulled over would be nervous, even if they hadn't done anything wrong. But the woman, who appeared to be in her 40s, simply handed over the documents without a word. As the officer took the papers, he noticed she didn't seem flustered. There was something about her composure that stood out to him. Most people would be anxious during a traffic stop, he thought, but she wasn't. That only made him more suspicious. His mind raced as he glanced down at the paperwork. Everything seemed in order, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Without warning, the officer demanded that the woman step out of the car. She didn't protest or argue. She simply raised an eyebrow, a flicker of confusion crossing her face. She had been polite, respectful, and calm, yet now the officer was acting as if she was a threat. The woman hesitated, unsure of why the officer was escalating the situation. "I need you to step out of the vehicle," he repeated firmly, his voice a little sharper now. The woman didn't say anything immediately. She simply looked at him for a moment before nodding slowly. She unbuckled her seatbelt, opened the car door, and stepped out, still calm. Her movements were deliberate, showing no signs of fear. But inside, she was wondering what was happening. Why had the officer gone from polite to demanding so quickly? The officer, growing more convinced that something was wrong, continued to question her. His voice grew more impatient, his words becoming more demanding. He asked her for more information about her background, and when she responded, he grew even more agitated. Something about her responses, her calmness, seemed to irritate him, though she had done nothing to provoke him. At this point, the woman decided it was time to end the back and forth. Reaching into her purse, she pulled out a small, official-looking card. She handed it to the officer with a quiet but firm statement, "I am a judge." The officer paused for a moment, staring at the card in his hand. His eyes widened in shock as he processed the information. He looked back at the woman, his mind racing. He had just pulled over a judge, not realizing who she was. The sudden realization hit him like a ton of bricks. He had been so focused on the small signs of suspicion that he hadn't bothered to recognize who he was dealing with. The tension in the air seemed to shift immediately, but the officer, unsure of how to react, struggled to find the right words. His apology was awkward and rushed, but the damage had already been done. Despite the fact that he hadn't physically harmed her, the whole situation had escalated unnecessarily. The woman, though clearly taken aback by the officer's actions, maintained her poise. She didn't raise her voice, nor did she respond with anger. Instead, she simply stood there, awaiting an explanation, or at the very least, an apology. The officer, still trying to compose himself, realized he had made a huge mistake, one that was going to haunt him for a long time. The woman's calmness was almost unsettling to the officer, but it also made him feel even more uncomfortable. He had made a judgment based on his own assumptions and biases, not on the facts. Little did he know, the simple traffic stop would lead to a situation that would make him question his own approach to policing forever. The officer stood there, holding the woman's card, feeling a mix of shock and embarrassment. He could hardly believe what had just happened. Just moments ago, he had been firm and demanding, treating her like any other driver he suspected of wrongdoing. But now, in his hands, he held the credentials of a judge, a woman who, it turned out, was far more important and accomplished than he could have ever imagined. His mind raced as he quickly tried to process the situation. He had made a mistake, a big one. He had treated a respected member of the judicial system like a common criminal, all because of his own snap judgments. The woman, however, was still calm, still composed, and didn't let her anger show. But the officer could see it in her eyes. He had crossed a line, and now he had to deal with the consequences. The woman's voice cut through the tension. She spoke softly, but with authority, telling him that she understood the role of the police and the importance of following procedure. However, she reminded him that his actions were based on assumptions, not facts. Her tone was firm, but there was no anger, only disappointment. She wasn't shouting or accusing him outright, but she made it clear that she was well aware of what had just happened. "I'm a judge," she said again, her voice steady. "I know how these things should be handled." The officer, flustered, tried to apologize, his voice shaky as he stumbled over his words. He offered a weak apology, saying that he hadn't meant to overstep. He explained that he had just been doing his job, but he could barely meet her gaze as he spoke. He had made a mistake, and he knew it. "I didn't realize," the officer mumbled, the weight of his error beginning to sink in. "I didn't know who you were." The woman nodded, her expression still calm, though a hint of frustration lingered in her eyes. "And that's the problem," she said. "You made an assumption based on my race, not on who I actually am. You treated me like a criminal without knowing a thing about me." Her words hung in the air, and the officer felt the sting of her truth. He had been taught to be suspicious of certain behaviors and to follow protocol, but nowhere in his training had he been taught to check his assumptions, to look beyond skin color, or to question his own biases. He had failed in this moment, and he knew that he would have to confront those failures if he ever wanted to be the officer he had hoped to be. Despite the tension in the air, the woman did not escalate the situation. She could have easily made a scene, but instead, she remained composed. She knew that in moments like this, her response mattered just as much as the officer's actions. She chose to take the high road, to show the officer that he didn't have to react with hostility, that there was a way to move forward with respect. The officer, now realizing the gravity of his mistake, offered a more sincere apology. He assured her that he would handle the situation differently moving forward, but even as he spoke, he knew that nothing could undo the wrong that had been done. The damage was done, and there was no taking back the moments that had passed. The woman's calm response had made him feel even more embarrassed, as he realized how his actions had been driven by stereotypes, not facts. As the encounter came to an end, the officer let her go, his mind still reeling from the experience. He walked back to his car, feeling a deep sense of shame and regret. This was not the way he had envisioned his first year on the force going, but at the same time, he couldn't ignore the feeling that this incident, this mistake, might be the catalyst for the change he desperately needed. Maybe, just maybe, this would be the moment when he learned to check his own biases, to become a better officer, and to truly understand the people he was sworn to protect. But that was a lesson that would take time to learn, and this was only the beginning of a much larger journey. The next few days were a whirlwind for both the officer and the judge. For the officer, the aftermath of the encounter became a source of intense reflection. He couldn't get the woman's calm, composed expression out of his mind. Her words about assumptions and bias echoed through his thoughts, and he couldn't help but wonder how he could have been so wrong. As he replayed the incident over and over, he began to understand the depth of his mistake. He had assumed so much based solely on the woman's race, and it had led him to treat her with far less respect than she deserved. For the judge, it was a strange and stressful experience, too. Despite remaining calm during the traffic stop, she couldn't help but feel a mix of frustration and sadness at the way the officer had behaved. The judge had encountered this kind of bias before, but never in such a direct and personal way. She had expected more from the police, especially when it came to dealing with people from diverse backgrounds. The incident had been deeply hurtful, even if she hadn't shown it. But she wasn't going to let this experience break her. She understood that change takes time, and that this was just one small piece of a much bigger puzzle. As the days passed, both the judge and the officer started to process what had happened. For the officer, it was a chance to dig deeper into the roots of his actions, to examine his own biases and beliefs. The training he had received up until this point had focused on procedures, not on the human aspect of policing. He realized that he had never really questioned his own assumptions before. But now, with the judge's calm demeanor and firm words still fresh in his memory, he couldn't help but confront the hard truth. He had allowed his judgments to cloud his understanding of the situation. For the judge, the experience was also a time for reflection. She had seen enough of these situations to know that they were far too common. It wasn't just about one officer. It was about a much broader issue within the police system. The judge had been a part of efforts to reform the justice system, to address racial biases and inequalities, but those efforts had never felt so personal until now. She wondered how many other people, especially people of color, had been treated unfairly by police officers simply because of their race or appearance. It was frustrating to realize that despite all the progress, there was still so much work to be done. Both the judge and the officer began to see the importance of addressing this issue more directly. They couldn't just ignore what had happened or write it off as a simple mistake. The incident had shaken both of them, but it also served as a powerful reminder that the problems of bias and discrimination in policing were real, and they weren't going away without action. For the judge, it meant redoubling her efforts to push for change. For the officer, it meant finally acknowledging that he had more to learn than he ever imagined. As the media picked up on the story, people all around the country started talking about it. Some people praised the judge for her calm, dignified response, while others criticized the officer for his lack of understanding. Social media was full of debates, opinions, and strong emotions. For the officer, it was a new kind of scrutiny, one he had never faced before. And for the judge, it was a painful reminder of how deep-seated some biases could be. Still, they both knew that this moment had the potential to be transformative, for both of them, and for the wider conversation about race and justice. The officer, struggling with his own feelings of guilt and inadequacy, started to seek out resources and training. He realized that he needed to go beyond just memorizing procedures. He had to understand how his own biases could impact his decisions on the job. So he began to seek out additional courses, books, and training sessions about race, diversity, and the importance of treating everyone equally, regardless of their background. The process wasn't easy, but he felt more motivated than ever to make a change. The judge, meanwhile, continued to do her job while also using her position to advocate for reform. She started speaking out more publicly about the need for better training and accountability for police officers. The judge knew that she couldn't just let this incident fade into the background. It had opened her eyes to the fact that real, systemic issues existed in law enforcement, and that those problems had to be addressed. Her work to bring about change, though slow and challenging, had suddenly taken on a new sense of urgency. And so, the story of this encounter continued to unfold. For the officer, it was a long and painful journey of self-examination, learning, and growth. For the judge, it was a chance to keep fighting for justice, even when it felt like progress was slow. Together, they began to contribute to a broader conversation about fairness, equality, and the role of the police in society. Their experience had opened up new possibilities for change, but also new challenges to overcome. And for both of them, it was clear that they still had a long way to go. The days after the incident were filled with a mixture of emotions for the officer. His department had begun an internal review of the situation, and he knew he couldn't just sweep it under the rug. The body camera footage from that day was being analyzed, and the higher-ups were looking closely at what had happened. He was called into a meeting with his supervisors, and he could feel the weight of their eyes on him. This was no longer just about a simple traffic stop. It had become a major issue. At the meeting, the officer tried to explain his side of the story. He told them that he had acted based on his instincts and training, but he couldn't deny that something had gone terribly wrong. His actions had escalated the situation, and he could see that now. The higher-ups weren't angry with him, but they were disappointed. They understood that he had made a mistake, but they also made it clear that this kind of behavior wasn't acceptable. This wasn't just about following protocol. It was about understanding people, seeing them as individuals, not just as potential threats based on assumptions. The officer felt the sting of their words. He had joined the force to protect and serve, not to make people feel unsafe or unwelcome. He had taken an oath to uphold the law. But now he realized that part of that duty was to recognize his own biases and work to overcome them. He was being told that he needed more than just technical training. He needed to learn how to be a better listener, to understand the people he was serving on a deeper level. Meanwhile, the judge was also reflecting on the incident, but from a different perspective. She had received messages of support from many in the community, but she had also received harsh criticism from others. Some people felt that she should have been more vocal in her condemnation of the officer's actions, while others praised her for handling the situation with dignity and calm. The judge knew that this was a complex issue, one that couldn't be solved with quick answers or simple solutions. The incident had brought to light the deep divides that still existed in society when it came to race, policing, and justice. She had seen firsthand the ways that bias could influence decisions, both in and out of the courtroom. But the traffic stop had reminded her just how deep those biases ran, especially in law enforcement. She had hoped that by being a judge, she could help bring about change in the legal system, but the encounter made her realize that there was still so much work to be done. Her focus shifted, not just to the specific incident with the officer, but to the broader issues of reform in policing, systemic racism, and accountability within the justice system. She knew that this wasn't just a one-off situation. It was part of a larger pattern of problems that needed to be addressed. The judge began to speak out more publicly about the need for reform. She used her position to advocate for better police training, especially when it came to understanding and addressing implicit bias. She also called for more transparency in police actions and for stronger oversight to ensure that officers were held accountable for their behavior. It wasn't an easy fight, but the judge was used to challenges. She had spent her career working in the justice system, and she knew that change would come slowly, but it would come if enough people pushed for it. The officer, on the other hand, was undergoing his own process of self-reflection. He enrolled in sensitivity training programs and began reading books on racial bias, privilege, and how to improve communication with people from diverse backgrounds. It wasn't easy for him. He had grown up in a world where certain stereotypes were ingrained, and he had never thought to question them. But now, with the events of the past week weighing heavily on him, he realized that it was time to confront these ingrained beliefs. One day, while attending a seminar on racial bias, the officer was forced to confront some uncomfortable truths about himself. The trainer spoke about how many police officers unknowingly carried biases that affected their interactions with the public. The officer felt his heart race as he recognized his own flaws, his own unconscious biases that had led to the incident with the judge. It was a humbling moment for him, but it was also the beginning of a much-needed change. As the weeks passed, the officer and the judge found themselves on different paths, but their experiences had connected them in unexpected ways. The officer's journey to becoming a more empathetic and self-aware officer was just beginning. He knew it wouldn't be easy, and he knew that he would face criticism and resistance along the way. But he also knew that the lessons he was learning were essential for him to do his job right. The judge, meanwhile, was becoming more vocal in her advocacy for reform. She understood that her position gave her a platform, and she was determined to use it to make a difference. She continued to push for changes in police training, but also for a wider societal shift toward recognizing and addressing racial inequality in all its forms. It was a long road ahead, but she was ready for the challenge. While their paths had crossed in a difficult and painful way, both the officer and the judge understood that their experiences had changed them. They were now more aware of the work that needed to be done, both within the police force and in society at large. Neither of them had all the answers, but they both knew that the journey toward change had to start with a willingness to learn and grow. And that journey was only just beginning. Weeks passed, and the effects of the encounter continued to ripple through the lives of both the officer and the judge. For the officer, the process of change was slow, but it was real. He was more aware of his actions and the impact they could have on others. He began to notice things he had never seen before, like the way certain people were treated differently by his colleagues, or how they looked at him with fear or distrust when he approached them. He had once believed that he was just doing his job, but now he realized that he had to be more conscious of how he approached his duties, especially when it came to interactions with people of color. At the police station, there was an increased focus on understanding biases, and the officer found himself talking more openly with his fellow officers about their own experiences. It was difficult at first. Many of them were defensive, unwilling to acknowledge that they might have biases or that their training had been incomplete. But the officer, driven by his own realization, pushed for the conversation to continue. He was determined to make sure that others didn't make the same mistake he had. It wasn't easy, and the process of changing long-held attitudes in the force was slow, but the officer knew that if even one person could see things differently, it would be worth it. The officer also reached out to community leaders, trying to learn more about the lives of the people he was sworn to protect. He attended town hall meetings and listened to the concerns of the community. For the first time, he started to understand the fears and frustrations that many of the people in his neighborhood faced. He began to realize that, as a police officer, he wasn't just there to enforce the law. He was also there to build trust and serve the community. He had a responsibility to ensure that people felt safe, not just from criminals, but from the very people who were meant to protect them. For the judge, the experience of being stopped and treated unfairly had opened up a new chapter in her advocacy for justice. She began speaking more publicly about the need for police reform, not just in her local area, but on a national scale. She wrote articles, gave speeches, and participated in panel discussions. The judge knew that the story of her traffic stop wasn't just her own. It was a reflection of a larger issue that affected so many others. She became more vocal about the systemic racism she had seen in her own courtroom and in the streets. But she also acknowledged that the change she sought couldn't come from a single individual or a single case. It required a collective effort, one that involved lawmakers, community leaders, and everyday citizens. The judge's advocacy didn't go unnoticed. She was invited to speak at conferences and workshops, where police officers and community leaders came together to discuss how to make the system more just and equitable. At one such conference, she met the officer again. It was a strange moment, and the judge was surprised to see him there. He had signed up for a workshop on implicit bias and racial inequality, trying to understand the things he had once overlooked. The two of them shared a brief, awkward conversation, but there was a sense of mutual respect that had not been there before. They both knew that they had come a long way since that traffic stop. The officer thanked her for being calm and respectful during their encounter, something that had helped him process the experience more effectively. The judge nodded, acknowledging that the officer's willingness to change had impressed her. While their paths had been separate in the months since the incident, they had both learned valuable lessons. The officer had learned that policing wasn't just about enforcing the law. It was about understanding people and serving them with respect. He knew that his job would never be the same, that he would have to work harder every day to ensure that his actions were fair and just. The judge, for her part, had learned that change was a long and difficult process, but it was worth the effort. She had seen firsthand the importance of using her voice to advocate for those who didn't have the power to speak up for themselves. As time went on, the two of them continued to grow in their respective roles. The officer became more involved in community outreach programs, organizing events where police officers could meet with local residents, hear their concerns, and build trust. It was a slow process, but he could see the change happening. People were beginning to open up to him in ways they hadn't before, and he was learning to listen rather than judge. The judge, meanwhile, was working tirelessly to push for legislative changes. She had seen how deeply ingrained racism and bias could affect the justice system, and she knew that the law had to be reformed to reflect the values of equality and fairness. She was committed to making sure that future generations wouldn't have to face the same injustices that so many had endured before her. Their efforts, though separate, were part of the same larger movement. Both the officer and the judge were working toward a common goal, creating a world where people were treated fairly, regardless of their race or background. And although the road ahead was long and filled with challenges, they both felt that they were moving in the right direction. They understood that change wouldn't happen overnight, but they were committed to the journey, knowing that their individual actions, however small, could make a difference in the world. Months passed, and the officer continued to dive deep into his journey of change. He found that the more he learned, the more he began to see the world differently. He attended more workshops on bias and racial justice, where he learned not just about the laws, but about the history of policing and how certain practices had been shaped by past prejudices. This new perspective was eye-opening. He began to understand why certain communities had an inherent distrust of law enforcement, and why some people felt threatened simply by his presence. One of the most striking lessons came during a ride along with a senior officer. The officer had been around for many years and had seen firsthand how the community had changed. He was old school in many ways, but as they went through different neighborhoods, he began to open up about his own experiences with bias and how it had shaped his career. The officer was surprised at how vulnerable his senior colleague was willing to be. They spoke about times when they had both treated people unfairly, based on race or class, without even realizing it. It wasn't easy to confront those truths, but the officer now understood that acknowledging these biases was the first step toward making things right. At the same time, the officer started to notice how his colleagues responded to his newfound attitude. Some were supportive, eager to listen and learn, while others were resistant, unwilling to face their own biases. The officer didn't let this discourage him, though. He knew that change was never easy, and that real progress often came in small, steady steps. He kept trying to model the kind of behavior he wanted to see: patient, fair, and understanding. Sometimes it worked, and sometimes it didn't, but he refused to give up. Meanwhile, the judge was also making waves in her efforts for reform. She had been invited to speak at national conferences and had even been asked to testify before a government committee on justice reform. Her words, grounded in her own experiences, resonated with many people, and her influence began to grow. She was becoming a respected voice in the fight against racial inequality, and her calls for reform in policing were gaining traction. Yet, despite her increasing visibility, the judge never forgot the personal nature of her struggle. The encounter with the officer was still fresh in her mind, and it reminded her that while systemic change was vital, it was also about the individual people involved. She continued to make sure that her advocacy wasn't just about policy changes, but also about changing hearts and minds. She believed that if she could help even one person, whether it was a police officer, a lawmaker, or a member of the community, see the world from a different perspective, it would make a difference. One day, after a particularly moving speech about the need for better police-community relationships, the judge received a surprising phone call. It was from the officer. He introduced himself, and after a few moments of awkward silence, he thanked her for the work she was doing. He said that her words had made an impact on him, and that they had influenced the way he saw his own role in law enforcement. The judge was taken aback at first, but she was also deeply moved. She had not expected to hear from him again, but hearing that he was committed to making a change brought her a sense of hope. They spoke for a while, exchanging thoughts on what real reform could look like and how important it was to continue pushing forward, even when progress seemed slow. This conversation was a turning point for both of them. The officer realized that reform wasn't just about changing policies or training. It was about creating a culture of understanding, empathy, and trust. He saw the judge as a symbol of that kind of change, and hearing her words reinforced his own commitment to his work. For the judge, the conversation was a reminder that change could come from unexpected places. She had spent so much time focused on systemic issues, but it was moments like this that reminded her that change also started with individuals willing to grow and learn. As the months went by, both of them remained in contact, occasionally sharing updates on their work and their journeys. The officer had become more involved in community outreach programs, volunteering his time to speak to young people about the importance of understanding each other and working together. The judge, meanwhile, continued her work in the courtroom, using her platform to advocate for policy changes and to support those who were fighting for justice. They didn't always agree on everything, but they both respected each other's commitment to making the world a better place. The officer began to feel like his efforts were paying off. Slowly, he started to see changes within his department. Some of his colleagues had started to ask more questions about the biases they carried, and some had even started attending the same training sessions he had. It wasn't a complete transformation, but it was a start, and that was enough for him. For the judge, progress meant more than just public recognition. She knew that real change would take time, but every step forward, whether it was a law passed, a policy reformed, or a conversation sparked, was worth celebrating. She had come to understand that change was rarely dramatic. Instead, it came in quiet moments, in the persistence of everyday people fighting for what's right. Looking back at where they both had started, neither the officer nor the judge could have predicted the impact this one incident would have on their lives. It had sparked a journey that neither of them could have imagined, but it had also brought them closer to the understanding that real change, both in themselves and in society, required constant effort, empathy, and an unwavering commitment to doing what was right. As the years went by, the officer and the judge continued to grow in their respective roles, both shaped by the encounter they had shared. The officer had come a long way from the man who had once assumed that a woman in a car could only be a suspect based on her race. Now, he was a police officer who understood the importance of treating everyone with respect and fairness. He had worked hard to earn the trust of the community and his colleagues. Through his continued education and efforts to open conversations about bias within the force, he was beginning to make a difference. He had seen the positive effects of the changes he made in his own actions and attitudes, and he became determined to help others on the force do the same. His focus was now on community building. He worked closely with local leaders to organize town halls where citizens could voice their concerns, ask questions, and share their experiences with the police. It was a place where people of all races could come together, speak openly, and feel heard. The officer was able to learn so much from these interactions. He began to see how important it was to listen to the community, to understand their fears, and to recognize the history that had shaped their experiences with the police. It wasn't just about enforcing laws. It was about healing wounds and rebuilding trust. As he continued his outreach work, the officer was faced with resistance from some of his colleagues. Not everyone was ready to accept the idea of reform, and some resisted the conversations about racial bias. It was difficult for the officer to see this, especially after the personal growth he had gone through. But he kept pushing forward, using his own journey as an example. Slowly, he began to see that the more open and honest conversations he had, the more his colleagues started to open up too. It wasn't going to be a fast process, but each small change was something to celebrate. He could feel that the culture in his department was starting to shift, even if just a little at a time. The judge, too, was seeing the fruits of her labor. Her work had led to some important changes in the justice system. She had helped to push for new policies that required police officers to undergo more extensive training in recognizing and addressing implicit bias. She had worked with lawmakers to ensure that new laws would hold police departments accountable for their actions, and that officers who violated the rights of citizens would face real consequences. The changes weren't perfect, but they were a step in the right direction. The judge had also become a sought-after voice in the media, appearing on news programs and writing articles that highlighted the importance of reform in the justice system. But despite the successes she had achieved, the judge knew that there was still much to be done. The work was ongoing, and she felt a constant drive to continue the fight for equality and fairness. She had come to understand that meaningful change didn't happen quickly, and it didn't happen alone. It was a collective effort, one that required the commitment of many people working together. She continued to be inspired by the voices of the community, by the people who had been fighting for justice long before her, and by the small moments of progress that proved that change was possible. In many ways, the officer and the judge's paths had continued to parallel each other. The officer had learned the importance of listening to the community and understanding their experiences, while the judge had worked tirelessly to ensure that systemic change was taking place at the highest levels. They were both committed to reform, each in their own way, but they both knew that the road to true equality and justice would be long. They had each learned to be patient, to keep moving forward, and to never stop fighting for what was right. Then one day they crossed paths again, this time not in a confrontation, but as colleagues working toward a shared goal. The officer had been invited to speak at a conference on police reform, and the judge was there to present a panel on the future of justice. The two of them had a chance to speak briefly before the event, catching up on everything that had happened since their first meeting. They shared stories about their struggles, their progress, and the lessons they had learned along the way. Both were proud of the work they had done, but they both knew that their journey wasn't over yet. There was still much more to be done, and they were ready for whatever came next. As they parted ways that day, they shared a quiet moment of understanding. They both knew that the changes they had worked for were only the beginning. The fight for justice, equality, and fairness would continue, and they were both willing to keep pushing forward. The officer knew that being a part of the solution meant never stopping, no matter how difficult the path was. The judge knew that her work was far from finished, and that the journey toward true justice would take time. But neither of them could deny the progress they had made, or the hope they felt for a better future. And so, the officer and the judge continued their work, each playing their part in the ongoing effort to make the world a more just and equal place for everyone. They had learned so much from their shared experience, and they were more determined than ever to see it through. In their hearts, they knew that change would not come overnight, but with each step they took, they were one step closer to creating a society where fairness, equality, and respect were not just ideals, but the foundation of everyday life.